Chapter 5, Part 1 of 2. When the alarm went off, it startled Mark out of a deep sleep. He reached for the alarm but couldn't find it. It took him a moment to remember he was in the camper. He found the alarm clock, turned it off, and looked at his watch. He was calculating if he could get a few more minutes of sleep when Jess rolled over. "What time is it?" she asked. 6 o'clock. "Go back to sleep." "Okay." She rolled over and pulled the sheet up around her neck. Mark remembered that last night he'd figured that he better get up at 6 if he was to make Todd's meeting at 7:30. He usually gave himself 45 minutes to make the normally 35-minute trip to work, but with all of the stalled cars, it might take an hour to get there. Most of the cars had been pushed to the side, but there were still a few in the roads. He pulled on a clean pair of jeans and a polo shirt, put on his socks and shoes, and headed over to Jim's camper to see if his friend was awake yet. There was a light on inside. Jim, Mark whispered. "Be right out," he heard Jim whisper back. A moment later, the door opened and Jim stepped out of the pop-up. He was dressed the same way Mark was. "Which vehicle are we going to take?" he asked. "Let's try to get the truck started. I'd rather take it, but if it won't start pretty quick, we'll take the Jeep," Mark answered. They walked over to the truck, and Mark cranked it on it for 5 minutes or so with no luck. He was ready to give up when Jim asked if they had any starting fluid. Jim said he remembered hearing an old truck driver talking about using ether to start semis before they had glow plugs. Mark found an old can of starting fluid in the shed and gave it to Jim. When he engaged the starter, Jim sprayed the fluid into the air cleaner intake. The truck started almost immediately but ran roughly for the first couple of minutes. While they were waiting for the engine to warm up, Mark got 5 jerry cans out of the shed and put them in the back of the truck. He hoped Todd would let him borrow some gas for the generator. When the idle smoothed out, both men climbed in and Mark eased the truck into gear and slowly let his foot off the clutch. When they approached the entrance to Silver Hills, it was just getting light enough to make out the 2 armed guards. Mark stopped the truck and Manuel Hernandez stepped up to the window. Mark didn't know the other man, but he recognized him from the meeting at John's house from the water line. Manuel was holding an old Winchester 30-30, and it looked like the other man had a shotgun. "Good morning, Manny," Mark said. "Everything go all right last night?" "Good morning to you, gentlemen," Manny replied. "No problem so far. Where are you off to so early?" "Our boss told us to come in to work today." Mark paused. "Hey, will you do me a favor?" "Sure." "I don't know how long we're going to be gone, but will you tell the guards to expect us back?" "I wouldn't want my tires shot out," he said with a wink. "No problem. We'll keep an eye out for you," Manny promised. "Listen," he was whispering now. "The chickens have been laying pretty good. I usually give the extra eggs away at work, but since I won't be going in for a while, Rosa and I want you all to have them." "Thanks, Manny. We'll come get them when we get home. That's very kind of you." "It was very kind of you to give us water, especially when you disagreed with us." "It was the right thing to do, and you would have done the same," Mark said. "Maybe, but I don't think some people would have." "Perhaps not." Mark patted Manny on the hand as he eased the truck forward and onto the road. Jim and Mark again discussed what could be so important that Todd would have them come in. They came to the conclusion that Todd probably wanted to know how much money the company could spare to help its employees, since they would be missing at least 3 or 4 days' work. The company was always very generous to its workers, especially during hard times. They didn't see another running car until they were well into town. Even then, it was only a couple of cars and a few of the city buses. At least on the major roads, someone had moved all the cars that hadn't already been pushed to the side. They were making better time than they thought they would. Jim commented that they were lucky the burst hadn't come at rush hour. "Think about the West Coast," he told Mark. "The burst hit them at about 7:30 their time. The way their highway system is always packed, they'll never be able to get the roads cleared." When they pulled up to the gate at work, Tom was there and opened it. Mark pulled the truck through and Tom closed and locked the gate. He then climbed into the bed of the big Ford and patted on the roof to signal that he was ready to go. Mark parked in front of the main office building, and the 3 men got out of the truck and headed into the conference room. Todd was already in there, and they all took seats. Jim and Mark on one side and Todd and Tom across from them. "Good morning." "You both have probably been wondering why I wanted you here today," Todd started. Both Jim and Mark nodded their heads. "First off, how are you and your families doing so far?" "Pretty good," Jim answered first. "Mark pulled my pop-up camper over to his place, and Lisa and the girls and I stayed over there last night." "You're not on city water, are you, Mark?" Mark shook his head. What was it like with no power and no water? The two friends looked at each other and grinned sheepishly. What? Did I miss something? I have a gasoline generator we used for camping and at the deer lease. One of the neighbors helped me wire the pump up on my well so we could plug it into the generator. Almost the whole neighborhood came over and got water last night. Then we plugged our campers up and ran the ACs long enough so we could sleep comfortably. Todd and Tom looked at each other. Mark couldn't tell if the look they were giving each other was one of amazement or humor or perhaps a little of both. Tell me, guys, Todd said, turning his attention back across the table. What would you do if the power was off for several months to a year? Why are you asking that? Mark said. You're the third person in 24 hours to suggest to us that the lights aren't going to be back on in a few days. Do you really know something? Or are you just speculating? And do you have any idea what caused the EMP? For now, let's just play what if. I'll answer your other questions later. Okay, Jim said. The first things to worry about would be water, food, and shelter. That's a good start. Let's take those one at a time, Todd said. It looks like you guys have water covered as long as you have gas for the generator. What about food? We probably only have enough at our house for the 8 of us for another week at the most. We'd need to buy some. And if you were talking about closer to a year, I'd try to put in a garden and raise some small livestock like chickens and rabbits, Mark answered. We have enough food at my house for probably 2 or 3 weeks, Jim added. Since Lisa doesn't work, she buys a lot of stuff in bulk to save money, and if something goes on sale, she buys a lot of it. Lisa knows quite a bit about gardening and small livestock since she grew up in the country. Then for shelter, Mark looked back over. We obviously have our houses, but they aren't meant to be lived in without power. Even with all the doors and windows open, it was really hot in our house yesterday afternoon. If you had an old house built before they had central air and heat, you could get by pretty well. We'd probably stay in our RVs. At least we would until it cooled off enough to stay in the house. That all sounds pretty good, Todd said. What else would you be concerned about? Mark answered first. The next thing I'd be worried about would be medical care and then the education of my children and our personal safety. I'd be worried about our families and friends, Jim added. Lisa's already worried about her parents. What's the point to all these questions, Todd? What do you know about the founder and chairman of the board of our company, Todd asked. You mean Mr. Davis? Todd nodded his head. They say he's crazy as a loon, kind of a modern-day Howard Hughes, Mark answered. Crazy like a fox, maybe. That would be closer to the truth, Tom spoke for the first time since the meeting started. Yeah.